the time now to 2025 and then from 2025 to 2030 are going to be very critical, I think, for those different iterations, whether it's digital therapeutics, whether it's the pharmaceutical model pivoting a little bit more or deeper into the core of what they do. And in terms of startups or digital health companies or digital therapeutic companies looking to a business like pharma as a real partner.
Herzlich willkommen bei Invenion und herzlich willkommen zu unserer Podcast-Reihe German Healthcare 2030. Invenion ist ein Venture-Studio und eine Beratungsboutique mit dem Fokus auf die Gesundheitswelt. Mein Name ist Julian Molitor und gemeinsam mit meinem Co-Gründer Khalid Uamar laden wir in diese Podcast-Reihe viele spannende Persönlichkeiten ein und fragen sie nach deren visionären Perspektive auf die deutsche Gesundheitslandschaft im Jahre 2030. Los geht's! Welcome to a new episode of our podcast, German Healthcare 2030. This one is actually in English because our guest is also English speaker. I'm more than happy to welcome Dominick Kennerson to this podcast as a guest for today. Welcome, Dominick.
Thank you so much, Julian.
I would like to give our audience a quick introduction of you so everyone knows who is the guest in the podcast. So Dominick is Global Head of G4A, which is the digital health partnerships entity of Bayer. I think Bayer we all know. G4A, in fact, was the first accelerator of pharmaceutical company in Europe. And the aim is to scale and support digital health companies through, on the one hand, commercial partnerships, but also through investments. Before Dominick joined G4A as a global head, he worked in other global functions at Bayer, for example, public affairs and communications. Originally, you are from Washington, Dominick, and also had a career in lab research, hospitals, in digital health startups, and in healthcare investment banking. So really a impressive track record in the digital health and healthcare area. As a global head of G4A, you have, of course, a quite good understanding of the digital health startup ecosystem overall, but also of the digital health trends, I think. And that is, of course, particularly interesting for our audience of this podcast. We got to know each other in the MedTech World Conference in Malta. And I'm more than happy to welcome you in this podcast. And I would suggest actually that we just jump into the discussion with a very broad question. So maybe you can give us your perspective of the overall level of digitization in the German healthcare system, as far as you have a detailed view on this, and maybe also overall. So where are we right now, and what do you think, where can we go in the future?
Thank you, Julian. I really appreciate the introduction. Really kind. And it's a pleasure to actually be here with you and your audience today. And ich kann Deutsch sprechen, aber I think for this conversation, it is probably best in English. And also Washington, D.C., not to be confused with Washington State is where I'm from. I think it's really interesting to think about German healthcare in 2030. So future casting a little bit. And when I think about it, I think about what I see, and I think about the actual, what I see actually on the ground when I walk around Berlin, where I'm based. I have also lived in Dusseldorf. And I also think about the trends that we see globally. And I think about where Germany kind of fits in that framework. And I think part of, where we always start with Germany is really the demographic development. So that's really one of the largest trends, I think, pointing towards 2030. And those trends, I think, suggest that we need a certain readiness, So right now, I think if you look at the stratification of the German demographic levels, almost every group is at about 20%, except for when you look at those that are 65 and older. So those 65 and older, I actually did look at the OECD statistics recently. They're at about 21.5%. By 2030, it's supposed to be about 29%, or almost 1/3 of the population will be 65 and older. And when I think about the readiness for digital health or for the healthcare system in general, I don't think we're ready yet. Um, for I think a number of different reasons. So first I look at the societal framework. And so I live near the Gendarmenmarkt in Berlin. Um, I normally take the U-Bahn station here at House Vogtei-Platz, which on Saturdays, this means that a lot of rentners go to the concert house very early in the morning before 10 o'clock. And what I notice is at this particular train station, there are no elevators, there are no escalators. And so what often happens literally every single Saturday morning is these little old women with their canes have to walk up a flight of stairs. And so even in a country like Germany that's so forward thinking, that has so many laws, um, there's not a law that's synonymous in the US. You have what's called the Americans with Disabilities Act. So essentially, this means that anyone in a wheelchair or with a walking cane should have access to an elevator or an escalator or a ramp or something. And the society is completely designed that way. And when I look at the public transportation system in Germany, it's not. And public transportation is one of those key infrastructure develop. This is part of what makes Germany Germany. And it's one of the things that's completely mind boggling to me. So this is kind of the societal layer. And when you look at the healthcare layer inside of that, if the societal layer needs that much development, then the healthcare layer absolutely needs that much, at least that much. I think the trend, in terms of people that can actually deliver healthcare services, so pharmacists, doctors, there's also going to be, I think, a real demand for that. What I'm curious about and what I don't know, and I think what would be interesting to look at, is how these physicians are aging. I hear people talk about how, uh, physicians in Germany are aging quite a bit. And I think this creates a really unique dynamic and a really unique challenge for Germany's purest bright spot in digital health and healthcare, being digital therapeutics. So, if I'm an old doctor, and I get paid on people actually visiting my practice, why would I write someone a prescription that keeps them away? One, and why would I write them a prescription for something for technology that I don't understand? And, the entire world right now is looking at the digital therapeutic reimbursement, the DIGA mechanism in Germany, and everyone is kind of touting it as a success. If you look at Emmanuel Macron, I think back in late October, he said that he wants a similar framework. Belgium is developing a framework. They have a framework. And so, Germany, there's there are still a lot of challenges, but this digital therapeutic mechanism, I think, is the gold nugget, around which the rest of the ecosystem has an opportunity to build and grow.
That's very interesting what you say in many ways. So, as I understand what you just say, on the one hand, we have the problem that we are not starting with the basics. So, for example, you gave the example of a wheelchair and the elevator. So, these are things which we, I think, have to solve first before we start thinking about any very sophisticated, crazy new solutions in healthcare. And the other one is that we have this lighthouse projects like the applications, the DIGAs, where we are the first one. But this is not solving the general problem, as I understand. Now, a question from my side to you, because you have a good understanding also of the startup world. Are startups helping to solve the basic problems, or are startups actually more focusing on very sophisticated solutions, which is still not helping, the old people who don't have access to certain solutions and so on?
Yeah, I don't think it's the role of a startup to solve society's problems. I think that there should be some ministry that is looking at these kind of big problems. I mean, a startup really has to focus on the one thing that they do and the one thing that they do well. Something that I failed to mention, kind of in the context of your first question for digital health readiness, I mean, there's the Digital Health Index that Bertelsmann published a few years ago,
Mm.
and they looked at 17 different countries. And what you see on that list out of those 17 countries, Germany is number 16, and at the top of that list, you have Estonia, a country of 1.3, 1.4 million people that can say today that they have 7 unicorn companies, you know, um, the largest unicorn producer in Europe on a per capita basis. And so part of that digital health index, what they were looking at was policy activity, digital health readiness, the usage of health data. And all of those different components, I think the way they work in Germany are generally complex, whether it's between Berlin and what happens in Brussels or what doesn't happen. It's, I think, the attitude towards data. Um, we know that there are different EU level initiatives. I was actually looking at something yesterday, the European health data spaces, and how this project is being rolled out at the EU level. And I thought it was so interesting, and it's also so telling because Germany, of course, is one of the most important countries in the European Union. Maybe I'm a little bit biased when I say that. But what was interesting is that part of this data space approach, they were going to survey certain countries about their attitudes towards data. And for Germany to be essentially the economic engine in Europe, it was not on this list of survey countries. There was France, there was Belgium, maybe even Spain. And all I could think was, oh, okay, whoever designed the survey did not want to come to Germany because they knew they would receive most likely a certain set of answers that were very much averse to federated data or to data flows, especially in the context of health. So I think fundamentally, and maybe to try to tie a bow on the question, um, startups have to do their one thing. Society and certain sectors of society have to be able to solve certain problems. And I think fundamentally, attitudes have to begin to shape and change in Germany. In terms of attitudes, one of the very clear resources that I can point to is the AmCham Germany Transatlantic Business Barometer, which was published in 2021. And when it comes to startups, I think many in German society still don't take them seriously. They're still cute, they're ambitious, they're fun things to do, but they're not serious business, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that's what you see in the Transatlantic Business Barometer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree here that the potential that startups can bring, also in terms of development, is definitely not in the same way recognized as it is, for example, in the US, but also in other European countries. You mentioned Estonia as a good example. Something that is also interesting, I think, as I understand, the current situation of digitalization in Germany is definitely not very good. There is a reason why we are always at the bottom of all rankings. Now the question is, what do you think can it look like, for example, in 2030?
Yeah. Um, well, I was looking at some of the OECD information, as I mentioned, and what they say is that primary care could be strengthened. And so essentially, they have two recommendations built around that. One, primary care means that you can reduce the avoidable hospital admissions, which are quite costly. Um, and essentially, there's a huge need for preventative care. So currently, Germany is quite below the OECD average in terms of prevention or wellness solutions. So, if the OECD can recognize that trend, I think that's the clear opportunity. And if you look at the DIGA list for the 28 or so approved products, there are, I think, several that fit into that wellness category. There are several that can impact, I think, hospital admissions or controlling that. I think at some point, uh, if we think about people that are over 65, how will they begin to engage with these digital solutions? I think someone has to begin to start thinking about that. When it comes to how digital health ecosystems really develop, over the last several days, I've been wondering, what lessons can Germany learn from Estonia? You know, um, whether it's kind of the taxation framework that Estonia has. I mean, they have, I think, a framework that limits double taxation with 60 different countries. And here I am, a US expat and US citizen that definitely is being double dipped into, but yet Berlin is supposed to be the founder city where, so many founders actually come. But Estonia actually has a much more attractive framework. I think when it also comes to startup maturity and digital health maturity, that's a mechanism that is hugely needed, I think, in Germany. So I was looking at the Gallon Growth European 2021 report, which if you haven't downloaded it yet, you should, um, because it really looks, at all of Europe, including the United Kingdom, and they have a very distinct taxonomy for the different digital health therapies. And when you look at where the value for startups comes from, it's often in, kind of the exit arena. And, I thought it was interesting that there were only two M&A exits from Germany, one for Pflege.de, another for My Therapy. And they were both valued at about the same. So in dollars, $80 million for Pflege.de, $81 million for My Therapy. What you did not have from an exit point of view, you did not have any IPOs, you did not have any SPACs. And these are, of course, kind of the larger ticket items. And I think this is a huge challenge for the German market because when you look at who's financing digital health, you have, EIT Health, you have a group like Bayer G4A, and you also have a lot of family offices, which tend to not be as sophisticated, that tend to invest in, what they like and who they know. And so what's happening when it does come to digital health solutions with Gravitas, you actually have a lot of American investors coming into Europe. And what that means is that that upside on exit value will belong to the States essentially. And there was actually an article last week in Sifted about this very trend, and so there are different, I think, layers of necessity. There's the actual healthcare layer, there's the financial layer, um, and all of these things. I think there are essentially vacuums around these needs that just have to be filled, you know, in the right way and with the right structure.
Yeah, I think definitely on the regulatory side, because you mentioned this tax example, but also there are many other examples, there is some change required to make the German market more interesting for innovation or innovators, and also to accelerate innovation. On the other hand, I definitely agree with the capital markets to have more funding available for startups. What is also interesting to have a more holistic perspective, not only looking at startups, what are the other players doing? For example, what are the responsibilities of pharmaceutical companies apart from regulators? I think regulators are clear; they have a lot to do, but also pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies. Maybe you have a perspective on this.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think starting with insurance companies have a very vested interest, and they should have a vested interest in digital health solutions, primarily because the business of insurance is really the business of risk pooling. And in order to minimize risk on the back end or later in life on very costly treatments, you have to have kind of that preventive model that we talked about before. You have to have a model that keeps people from going into the hospital, especially when you have a tax base in a social system with a very changing demographic, and a number of renters on the other side of that demographic. So essentially, what that means, not just for Germany, but for most of Europe as well as for the United States, healthcare financing is high on everyone's agenda, especially 2030 and after. 2030 will be a key, kind of a pivotal year, I think. Um, I think for the biopharmaceutical industry, it's also a very unique situation because what you have at most companies are looking for pill companion digital health solutions. We have a little bit of a different approach at Bayer, where we are looking at integrated care models that can change behavior. And, um, I think what has not happened with many of those pill companion solutions is you don't have, I think, a very strong revenue model in most cases that can replace the traditional drug model. And I also think for digital therapeutic companies, or digital health companies, they have to begin to shift their thinking because right now the thinking is always about pharma being a customer.
Mm.
And I think that thinking has to begin to change in terms of how can pharma be more of a partner and how can we partner with pharma. I think from a pharmaceutical point of view, the market trend that I see, especially through the lens of the DIGA, is you have, I think, at least half a dozen different therapies on that list that have actually increased their reimbursement rate. Whether it's, 200 euro or up to 400 euro. I think the first one that I really noticed was Calmeda, and it was not an insignificant increase, to have a clinically validated product. And this is, I think, ever since, the Martin Shkreli Pharma Bureau days, the price of the traditional drug business has been hugely scrutinized. And if I'm to scope this out to 2030, I think this trend will continue. I think that most of the biopharmaceutical business and the space is really starting to focus on cell and gene therapies, on rare diseases, and the traditional pill model is it's starting to go the way of the dinosaur.
Mm.
I think there has to be certain uh, testing grounds. I think the time now to 2025 and then from 2025 to 2030 are going to be very critical, I think, for those different iterations, whether it's digital therapeutics, whether it's the pharmaceutical model pivoting a little bit more or deeper into the core of what they do. And in terms of startups or digital health companies or digital therapeutic companies looking to a business like pharma as a real partner.
I think that's a very good point, looking at pharmaceutical companies as a partner, which I know from a personal relationship I have to other startups. That is something definitely startups are starting to look into. What I think is also interesting as a last point of this podcast, maybe, what do you think is the biggest, on the one hand, challenge for us, on the other hand, also the biggest opportunity of this digital health trend?
The biggest challenge, I think, is speed. I think that when I normally talk to US companies or US culture companies, especially if they're East Coast based, maybe it's a little bit different on the West Coast, but they approach their business mentality for growth is go, 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 go.
Mhm.
And I think in Europe, um, it's cultural. It's a little bit different, which I think to a degree is fine. I think especially for an early company, you have to put in the blood, sweat, and tears, but work life balance is also quite important. I think the biggest opportunity is to maybe I'll connect it to one of your first one or two questions because although startups aren't made to solve society's problems in a certain way, they do um, they startups, I think especially in healthcare, are solving solutions in very defined areas. So to reduce cardiometabolic disease, you know, and I think the opportunity is for an early company to be able to say, we've served 1,000 patients, 10,000, 100,000, which has saved the German healthcare system X millions of euro. That's the opportunity. And once you have that high level of data and once companies are able to say that those savings will begin to show in the healthcare budget. And I think they will be very, very meaningful. I think that's the real opportunity to help people and to change society in a different way, at a scalable way through digital health.
Then let's hope that we get the speed and then we can materialize all these opportunities. Dominick, thanks so much for being guest in this podcast. It was really a great conversation with you. And I look forward to stay in touch, and maybe there will be another opportunity that we have you as a guest.
I hope so, Julian. This was a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Dominick. Für einen gelungenen Abschluss noch ein paar Worte zu Invenion. Bei Invenion arbeiten wir eng mit den verschiedenen Akteuren im Gesundheitsbereich, angefangen mit Leistungserbringern und Kostenträgern, über Pharma, Diagnostik, Medizintechnik bis hin zu Startups und Investoren. Hierbei behandeln wir Themen wie Strategie, Produktdesign, Produktentwicklung, Data Analytics und Data Science, wie auch Finanzen und Transaktionen. Mehr Informationen gibt es auf unserer Webseite unter www.invenion.io. Viel Spaß beim Durchstöbern und hoffentlich bis bald.